Welcome to Poets and Thinkers, the podcast where we explore the future of humanistic business leadership. I'm your host, Ben, and today I'm speaking with Omari Souza. Omari is an assistant professor at the University of North Texas. He's also the organizer of the State of Black Design Conference. Omari is a first-generation American of Jamaican descent, raised in the Bronx, New York City. He earned a BFA in digital media from Cleveland Institute of Art and an MFA in design from Kent State University. Omari's research explores the idea of perceptions and how visual narratives influence culture, how we view ourselves and others around us. I knew I wanted to sit down with him to have the conversation about the past, present, and future of design ever since reading Omari's book, Design Against Racism. And it just so happens that this episode will come out in the same week of Fast Company publishing an article about Joe Gebbia, the United States Chief Design Officer. The article is titled, Joe Gebbia is Reshaping the Government in Trump's Image. However, this isn't the first time in history that this has happened. Design has always been political, despite what many people might try to argue. Omari and I dive into the history of Western design and how it has unfolded since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I loved listening to Omari sharing his wisdom and his concrete examples, from the classroom to the real world, on how a distorted understanding of design and business leadership has led to design and business practices that are inequitable and are causing actual harm, often for generations of marginalized communities. As we're witnessing and designing the mass deployment of AI systems, we have the chance and opportunity to correct the wrongs of the past. But that requires critical examination and redefinition of the role design and business leaders play in setting the right priorities and enforcing them against the pressure of short-term shareholder capitalism. All right, let's get into the episode. If you like the show, make sure you like, subscribe, and share this podcast. Omari, where does this podcast find you?
This podcast finds me I have a few weeks after the release of my second book, Design Against Racism, during my time at University of North Texas.
And for those who don't know you or off your book, give us a little bit of an intro to who you are, what you do, what drives you in the work that you do.
Yeah, I'm a New York native, born in Brooklyn, raised in the Bronx, first generation American, coming from a family from Jamaica. So I'm first generation of Jamaican descent. I'm a design researcher by trade, founder of the State of Black Design Conference, which has been a conference that's been running for roughly 6 years now, predicated on opening doors and bridges to marginalized, aspiring designers who are hoping to enter the field, and also an author.
That's one of the reasons I reached out to you, because I think you're contributing to different fields, really meaningful work that I would love to explore a little bit more, especially in the context of the future of business, because I think there's a lot of things that are being rewritten or need to be rewritten. And I think learning from you and listening to you and reading your writing, I think will be incredibly rich. So with that said, you just mentioned already that you've just published your second book, actually. This one is titled Design Against Racism. And when I saw that pop up actually in my LinkedIn feed, I thought, first, well, that's super timely and important, especially in the current time. And at the same time, obviously, because of the times we're living in, also a really courageous thing to do. You might not feel like that, but I certainly do. And I applaud you for that. So maybe we'll talk about the book first. Tell me about the book. Why now specifically? And what are the kind of key points and themes that you're exploring in the book?
Yeah, so the book is something that has been 3 to 4 years in the making. So backtracking. The book itself took 3 to 4 years to write. And the material of the book was inspired by a number of things, from personal experiences to readings and investigations that I've done during my experience as a researcher and just my own personal readings. One, as I mentioned, I'm a first generation American, but also a part of the first generation of my family to attend university. And while doing so, growing up in New York City, which is a city that's extremely diverse, my collegiate experience all took place in the state of Ohio, where that diversity that I became accustomed to in New York City was not there. I was the sole Black male graduating out of my program from my undergraduate experience, even though the city of Cleveland happens to have a fairly healthy Black population. None of those, no one from Ohio graduated along with me that shared my skin tone. So for me, there was this investigation which my graduate thesis was all focused on. Where are the black designers, and why aren't we seeing in the field and in the classrooms? And what I found at the time was that there are a larger number of graduates from university that happen to be black, but the majority of them were more focused on social serving fields, fields that allow them to advocate for themselves, advocate for others that they care about, or address injustices that they felt moved by, while design communicated itself as this politically neutral but consumption focused field that would allow you to build and work for fancy companies whose products may not, be accessible by the people that look like you in the communities that you've grown up in. So for me, my focus became, how do I now meld these two practices, especially considering, the field of design research and design strategy were becoming more prominent in what employers were looking for. In doing so, realized that a lot of design practitioners who were design researchers used bastardized versions of social science practices
Hmm.
in order to conduct research, but didn't expand upon what was being done or even spend additional time with the social science methodologies and the evolution of those methodologies, or the evolution of conversations around particular methodologies, especially with dealing with new audience bases. And that's where the inspiration came from. If designers are using this truncated version of methodologies, is it really successful, or are we just doing what we feel feels good?
Right.
There's an adage that we would always hear, like, design does no harm. But I would often push back and say, is it that we do no harm, or is it that we don't teach you how to measure the implications of what it is that we've designed?
Very
So
good point. Yeah.
yeah, the question and the focus of this book was, is design creating harm? If it's creating harm, what is the root of that harm? And what can we introduce to the design practice in order to be restorative? Restorative by means of, healing the harm that's been caused and reestablishing trust with the people that we're designing for. And that became the initial questions that I sought to answer with this exploration.
In a lot of ways, this reminds me of, I spent the last 3 years before going full time on teaching in the digital accessibility space on, enabling people with all sorts of disabilities to become full contributors to society and the economy. And not dissimilar, where I think designers and more broadly speaking, product makers, certainly businesses as a whole, have seemingly found good stories to tell themselves that they were doing good, but in fact, actually doing harm in more ways than one, right?
Hmm.
And it seemingly is also part of the black experience that you're describing. So there's a historic part of just a historic examination of the book, right? And then from what I understand, you're also talking about, okay, well, what does this mean now? How do we actually go about now knowing this and acknowledging this history? How do we start changing practices, understanding? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think for many professors of design, we treat design as a trade, but we also treat design as a siloed skill set,
Hmm.
separate from history, separate from cultural and political influences. We treat it as if design is an island unto itself, and everything that happens outside of design has no influence on the practice itself, which is bullshit. The reality of it is, design is a tool similar to a hammer, similar to a pair of scissors, and it serves a particular function. And in a lot of ways, the commercialization of design, the way it's practiced today, means that it's an extension of larger corporations. And in reality, a lot of design is also a method of perpetuating ideas, prioritizing and solidifying hierarchies that already exists.
Hmm.
And a lot of professors who teach aren't aware of this historical reality, and they're passing this nullified, perspective of design being not political, which also is bullshit,
Hmm.
students, and stripping them of the ability to think critically about what they make, how they make, and who it impacts. Speaking directly to the idea of design not being political, everything you make is being made with intention. And as author Melissa Harris Perry would say, the act of being political isn't a determinant of political party or isn't determinant on advocacy for a particular group, but it's really an extension of directing someone's gaze. If I can get you to divert your attention from one space to another, that's a political action. If I can get you to pay more attention to this thing versus that thing, that is a political action. And design, within itself, if it's telling you, buy more from Apple, buy more from McDonald's, while also ignoring these other scenarios that their consumers may be facing. That within itself is a political choice. You're choosing to advocate for consumption versus advocating for the people. You're choosing to advocate for the corporations versus the workers that work there or the people that buy the products. So that within itself is a political choice that we participate in, whether or not we choose to acknowledge it in action, or the lack of acknowledgement doesn't mean what you're doing doesn't have political beneath them. You're just not consciously acknowledging them. So for me, before I can talk about the failures of design or before I can talk about how design harms, I have to talk about how we got to where we are now.
Mm-hmm.
I have to talk about colonialism. I have to talk about the hierarchical systems that have been very prevalent in Western society. I have to talk about how we tell stories through design visually and the motifs in which we've still perpetuated times that we, in America at least, try to ignore versus address. And in doing so, then begin the expansion to talk about, okay, now we politically feel like we've gotten away from some of these things, but here is how some of these motifs and solidified systems and way of telling story still find their way into the source code of design today, that still imply some of the same hierarchical systems that we thought that we got away from beforehand, or perpetuate some of the same harmful motifs that we used to prior. And then begin the discussion around, how can we now change this? What are things that we can do to the methodologies that we're currently using that would expand upon them to make them more equitable in their approach? And also discuss that, realistically, whenever you're doing things more equitably, it's not simply because you're doing it because it's for a particular group that's being marginalized. But a lot of the innovation in design comes from thinking about the bottlenecks that particular stakeholders have. And
Right.
then when you can fix the bottlenecks for the people that are having the worst experiences, sometimes it's where the innovation comes and improves the experience for everyone.
Yeah, that's what we saw at the accessibility space time and time
Yes.
again.
There's so many examples. I talk to my students about it and I'll say, how many of you text message more than you do phone calls? To which all of my students will raise their hand and I'll say, do you realize that that was built for somebody with disabilities to permit them to be able to communicate digitally with folks because they couldn't talk on the phone in the traditional way that you do? How many of you guys use audiobooks? To which many of them will raise their hands, which was also built for disabled populations. And then I'll say to them, do you see now how if we were to focus primarily on able-bodied populations, that some of these innovations that we enjoy today wouldn't be as readily available due to the fact that we only chose to focus on the status quo versus expanding it to think about people outside of ourselves.
And that goes all the way, and I want to pull that out specifically because I think it goes all the way, of course, to even the aesthetic understanding of what good design or excellent design looks like and feels like. Because you mentioned colonialism a minute ago. That's something that people are also not aware of, not even in the design community often. So I think calling that out just as another piece to look at. And what I found interesting is, as I was looking through your material and preparing, going back maybe 100 years to the Bauhaus, right? There's a lot of justified criticism that you can apply to the Bauhaus, which has in a lot of ways become sort of a certainly Western standard for good design. And on the one hand, you see some of the founders of the Bauhaus very clearly articulate that design needs to take a stance, a political stance, a moral stance, an ethical stance, that a design is aware of its social responsibility on top of its, economic responsibility. And at the same time, there's a lot of the work that came out of that era that has actually aided in perpetuating some of these narratives. It aided fascism in some regards. It has suppressing certain human rights and civil rights. Now, the thing here is this just a natural thing that a discipline has to wrestle with? Or from your research, what have you found in terms of parallels maybe other disciplines or just a historic context that helps us understand that. And also then, because I'm very much so interested in kind of figuring out where we go from here into the future, what does this tell us? How do we take all of that, acknowledge it, atone to it, and then move into the future with a better, more whole, more inclusive approach?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you are spot on with everything that you were saying. I think so. When I speak about colonialism in the book, in the first section of the book, part of what I'm talking about is which the main goal of colonialism is really this control through military force of resources and maintenance of particular people. Right. When colonialism ended, there's still the control of people through trade routes, introduction of products, services, and things of that nature. And that helps sell these products within itself is design. Germany, during the time of Bauhaus and predating Bauhaus, was a colonial party, just as many other European countries were. And as they were establishing the Bauhaus movement, not only did they have their markets within colonial spaces, but also were a collector of art and artifacts from several countries that were
Yes.
formerly colonized. The Smithsonian did an exhibit called Aid to Bauhaus or Africa to Bauhaus, which talked about how the Western African art pieces were huge influencers of many of the
Mm-hmm.
motifs found in the Bauhaus school system or were studied. It's not just them. Picasso similarly studied African art before crafting his pieces. So I speak about them in this context to talk about how design has assisted in perpetuating control. But even the things that we've heralded, sometimes the acknowledgement isn't just how design has assisted in controlling, but has also omitted other contributors to the history. So
Correct.
design
Yes.
has been a system of saying, this is what Western design should be. This is what the practice, needs to look like and things of that nature. But it was really a sterilized version of influences from other cultures that
Mm-hmm.
never got the credit for it and were never got the investment into their society and their culture, even through academics. When I've taught at several institutions that annually will have this design pilgrimage to Germany to go to the Bauhaus school, but how much so would some of these other countries have similar pilgrimages if they were also acknowledged? But that's an aside. I think to the point of what we do differently, and is it human nature to then articulate that design needs to have a political presence, but then turn around and then still marginalize others? I think the problem is people that are operating in spaces of power fall within an in group. And when they become outgroupers, they're only familiar with their outgroup identities and the power that they feel like they should have or the rights they feel that they should have without any understanding of the outgroups outside of themselves. And there are examples
Mm-hmm.
that I give in the book where I kind of criticize how traditional professors teach design and the limitations around blind spots that people that are building things have. A very common example that I talk about in most of my interviews that I also included in the book is how I begin a lot of my classes. What I'll do is I'll ask the men and the women separately to give me a journey map and list the number of steps that it would take for you to use the bathroom at a concert or a sporting event, and then to go to the bathroom and then come back to your seat. And what you'll find when you have them do it in a silo is that the men will take 3 to 5 steps. I get up, I walk to the bathroom, I find my
Mm-hmm.
stall, wash my hands, I go back to my seat. And for the women, it'll range from 8 to 30 steps and sometimes more, which is I'll get up, I'll find the line to the bathroom, I'll try to find the stall that's big enough for me. Depending on the cleanliness of the stall and the complexity of my outfit determines what I do next. If there's a place for me to hang my purse, if I'm on my cycle, if
Right.
I'm currently with a child, if I'm all of these things add a myriad of steps to what their bathroom experience looks like. And then I will ask the men in the room, to raise their hands, to keep their hands elevated until I say something that they don't agree with. And the statement that I make is, I believe that prior to women sharing these additional steps to me, that I could have designed. No, I believe that I can design an equitable experience for women to go to the bathroom prior to these details being shared with me about
Mm-hmm.
the steps
Mm-hmm.
that they take, to which all of the men begin to drop their hands because their gender places them within an in group.
Yes.
And because they're in an in group, they have blind spots to what the out group experience happens
Right.
to be. And because they have blind spots, there's very little empathy for it because they don't even know it exists. Now, simultaneously for the women, and this is the piece that I will like parallel with Bauhaus. They fall within that out group. So they're aware of the steps that the men have to take to go to the bathroom, and they're aware of the steps that they have to take. So I'll ask them, how many of you believe that prior to all of the other women sharing their steps, that you would have been able to equitably design a bathroom experience for the men and the women in the room, so which the majority of them will keep their hands elevated. But
Yeah.
then I'll say, what if the woman that you're designing for is trans or disabled,
Right.
or comes from a part of the world where the flushing mechanism on the toilet is different, or the iconography for the bathroom may be a bit different? Do you still feel that you can equitably design a bathroom experience for them? To which all of the women progressively begin to drop their hands as I
Mm.
change intersectional pieces of the identity of the person that they're designing for. And I use this to then articulate to them, you fall into an out group. But even within your out group, you still fall in, and you still have in group identities that blind you to some of the out group identities that other people may have, and who may also fall into women. So as designers, we now have to consider, what is the product that we're making? Who is engaging with this product? What is the positionality of those consumers? And how do I now strategically plan for my blind spots as to not create further harm for them? Because if I'm only designing for my own well being, and if I'm only designing to absolve my own bottlenecks, I can be creating a myriad of issues for other people in other areas. I also talk about text messages. I'll ask my students, how many of you have iPhones? To which the majority of the room will raise their hand. And I'll say, what is the most annoying thing to you about text messaging somebody with an Android? To which someone will say, the green bubble, or like two or three other things that are superficial things, but it bothers them. And then I'll stop them and I'll say, how many of you iPhone users can identify what annoys Android users about text messaging iPhone users? So which the room will go silent. And then I'll say, you realize that you're in a UX design course.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and I'll say, so if I asked you to design an equitable text messaging experience, and you have no idea as to what the annoyances or the bottlenecks in the experience that Android users have with text messaging Apple users, you feel like you can you will be able to do that, to design equitably for them without being able to understand their difficulties. So which they then look at look at me as if, I've opened up a box of thoughts that they've
Right.
never considered before. But I think that's a part of the problem. And I don't want to say for all of the professors from Bauhaus, because I know a number of them fled due to political persecution. But sometimes, even with advocacy, there are people that advocate, and their advocacy is limited to their positionality, the intersections of their identity that feel
Yeah.
oppressed, without consideration for other people. And they may count it as a win if they get the things that they need, but they're not necessarily considering how their victory creates a substantial loss for others that have outgroups that they've not even necessarily considered in their advocacy.
Right. Which is a great segue into my question, my big question around, what does all of this mean in the age of AI? I have an idea and understanding listening to you, but I would love to get your take on what we're currently seeing. And the reason I'm asking is not so much because of it being a general purpose technology, that in itself would already obviously justify the question, but I think also the speed at which this is deployed and all of its impact, essentially. What are your thoughts on that? And really, mainly, what I'm trying to get to is, um, what can we do in the way we're teaching, consulting, guiding, mentoring leaders into the future, so that we can learn from history and we can make sure that we're not simply reproducing the same patterns and mistakes.
Yeah. I mean, I think the danger with AI is due to the fact that as it stands right now, it's all rooted in information that's uploaded to the system. A lot of information that we currently have is limited in scope and perspective. So it becomes really hard to get something that can be used in equitable benefit when the society that we live in isn't equitable. If It's not as if artificial intelligence is at a point in technology where it's thinking for itself. ChatGPT, Perplexity, all of these things really just regurgitates whatever's been uploaded. So if you have a number of people that are uploading information that's limited in scope, and then you have a number of people that are using these platforms that aren't able to think critically or ask it challenging questions, you now have people being presented with information as if it's true, to which the AI systems can become their own echo chambers,
Yes.
which becomes extremely harmful for people of marginalized groups and identities, or can be a very radicalizing tool for people of particular political thought because of what's being uploaded. I think for myself, what I feel could be done is I feel like it really needs, well, backtracking. I think what's really important for us right now is to spend more time focusing on challenging how the students that we teach think, not teaching them how to think, but to think
Hmm.
critically what's being taught to them. I
I
often,
agree.
my students, what I think and feel doesn't matter. I am not asking you to think like me. I am not asking you to feel like me. I do not matter in the grand scheme of things. You will take this class with me or series of classes with me. You will graduate and you will live your life and you will never have to think about me again. However, you will have to think, and training those muscles to think that way you don't just believe anything that anybody tells you. It's imperative. I don't know if you've ever taken martial arts, but for a lot of martial artists, we use a term called McDojos, which is a critique of the serialization of martial arts schools and like these hyper franchises where they'll open them up
Yes. Hmm.
and like, yeah.
Yeah.
But in opening up these mega franchises, it's not rooted in building super competent fighters all the time. It's normally a fast food system of giving people belts so that they feel like they've accomplished something, and then they go out into the world, and you see these black belts who functionally are not much different than a white belt or a yellow belt or a blue belt. You know, they've gone through this process, but they're not any more competent or not much more competent than they were when they began. And I compare that to a lot of institutions because it's the same thing.
Hmm.
Professors are encouraged to teach courses, get these high evaluations from students, and then pass them along so that at the end of the year, there's a certain amount of people that are matriculating through the system or it's deemed a failure. But in operating that way, the positive evaluations sometimes comes by way of making curriculum less challenging versus giving less work, treating the courses more like you're a waiter at a restaurant and you're servicing a customer versus actually challenging them.
And make them functioning humans that we can send out into the world that ultimately contribute to improving society, right?
Exactly.
Which is something that has been coming up in some of the conversations that I've had on this podcast. I think that it's the self understanding of not even the designer per se, but the entrepreneur or the business leader, of understanding that the business in itself or revenue generation or maximization is not the end itself, right? It's ultimately a business is in the service of society.
Yes.
And the goal should be to create a net positive outcome for society. And there might be subsets of society, maybe in the first step, but certainly reconfiguring or calibrating this self understanding, I think, plays a large role in what you're saying of what becomes the highest priority order bit that you're actually gearing toward.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, unfortunately, businesses today in the United States don't operate with the idea of what is my service to society. More than likely is what is my service to my stakeholders,
Shareholder. Yeah.
my shareholders.
Yeah.
How can I turn a larger profit? And in reality, whenever you're thinking in that context, it's very hard to have humane outcomes when the main focus is the profit of the organization. And it's not to say that people don't deserve to eat, but also whenever profit becomes a primary focus and the primary return on the investment that you're looking for, sometimes acquiring of more of that money becomes that primary focus on a day to day. So it's no
Right.
longer if I need this to survive or to eat or to be comfortable, but I need to continue giving my shareholders even more and more and more money. I need to cut these corners in order to make this possible. I need to work people more hours, pay them less, and give them less support, and so that I have more money that I can give to myself and to the shareholders, and that becomes hard to thread the needle to do both. You can't both service your community and make these high record breaking profits annually. It just won't happen. One will have to give for the other. And I think we've been teaching people that they need to be able to produce these high profits at the detriment of the communities that, would need them and could benefit from their attention.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very extractive, exploitative approach, and where really the shift could be away from profit for profit's sake to
Mhm.
prosperity, right? And prosperity now is interesting because that, in my definition, goes beyond just maximizing profit for a few. Right? Prosperity, and it goes beyond monetary prosperity as well, right? That's just maybe one aspect of it, the capitalistic side of prosperity.
Mhm.
So, having said all of that, I wanted to ask you, because you have also, aside from your research work, your teaching, you've been, as you mentioned at the beginning, you've been a community builder first and foremost. You've built this amazing community. I think one of the articles that I read in preparation for this, you started a conference and you were expecting, a few hundred people to come, and it ended up being thousands to come to the conference, which, I mean, incredible for many, many reasons. So I want to ask you about the design community. Specifically, actually, I want to ask you about the design leadership community because, part of a variety of different design leadership groups, also more broadly business leadership groups. There's a lot of, I think, justified criticism. I want to get your sense for, is design leadership lost? Has it been lost? Has it been kind of lost in its own echo chamber? And if that's the case, which I think it might be in a lot of ways, what could a redefinition of that look like? What could be a redefinition of design leadership look like in the context of what you described, in the context of maybe the world that we're heading into? I believe that the perspective we can bring as design leaders, if we understand our responsibility the way you've outlined it, is huge. There's, I think, a huge potential impact on people's lives, but we would need to redefine our self-understanding. So I would love to get your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think design has been lost in its own echo chamber, and I think it has been for quite some time. I think we've used the Bauhaus and Swiss style of design as the central blueprint for us for several decades now, with very little expansion on it. There has been, to my knowledge, no new manifesto that we've been using to influence design and design approaches. And what you're finding now is when you visit one institution to the next, the portfolios are beginning to look almost identical from one
Yep.
school to the next. There's no institution that is stepping out to try something completely different. No way of thinking that expands upon what already exists. So what we're finding is it's just a rinse, wash, and repeat, and it's making design a lot less interesting or exciting because there's nothing new to anticipate. I think what design needs, and a part of what I needed to do for the book in the very beginning, is to articulate a definition for design. And I think in many ways, whether you're a graphic designer, you're an industrial designer, interior, fashion, architect, UX, UI, or whatever the case may be, you define design from the lens of your practice. But for me, I needed to make it a bit more broad. That way it can be a bit more inclusive of other things that can come and also be influential. So I define design as anything artificial that augments, amplifies, or curates human existence. The clothes that we wear, the chairs that we're sitting in, the devices that we're speaking on right now were all designed by somebody for a particular function and purpose. And if we identify that the things that are designed influence the culture and how we exchange with one another, then we have to understand that there is a purpose behind what we're designing and there is going to be an impact for it. Whenever I'm attempting to illustrate this, I'll normally ask people in the audience, and you can do it with me. If I were to ask you to play phone call with me, all right? And I want you to pretend like I'm calling you and I go ring, ring, ring. How would it look if you picked up your phone?
I'll say, hi, this is Ben.
And even this gesture showcases age, right?
Yes.
Because
Yeah, my daughter would do this.
yeah, they would do this or they would do this, right?
Yes.
And if you were to ask my grandmother, she would probably, do the rotary dial thing because that was what was accessible by technology for her. So that showcases, even in terms of hand gestures we use to communicate with one another, technology influences how we communicate those pieces. think once you expand it to being anything artificial, you now have to consider the fact that everyone can be a designer because there's a philosophy behind everything that's being made. And that means the janitor that cleans the halls can be a designer. It means the person that's coming in from an immigrant community who has been prior ignored also brings with them a culture and a rationale for making things that we've probably not experienced. And if we are going to find new ways of doing things and new ways of thinking, we have to be expansive in terms of who we consider designers to be and the types of
Yes.
philosophies of making that exist in the world rather than recycling the same methodologies that we've been leveraging since, World War One, World War Two.
Yeah, essentially, yeah, which is also what I often go to is since essentially the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where
Yes.
industrial design has in many ways become the definition of design. It's interesting that I love your definition for many reasons. The definition that I've been using is similar and different in some other ways. I describe design as giving shape to intent
Hmm.
with the goal to influence behavior. And because the main reason I'm using that definition is because I want my students and the people that I teach to be aware of the impact directly or indirectly that we have on people's lives. And I think that has become particularly important in especially recent technology advancements like AI, where we're so close to the human body that
Yeah.
there's been loss of life because we are messing with people's biochemistry.
Yes.
But I think they overlap very well, those definitions. And I think it also then speaks to the role of a design leader to
Hmm.
not only take up the tools, but also the responsibility that comes with that
Yes.
to actually say, no, this is in fact the way this can be used as a tool or a weapon. This is how it can do harm. And here's how I'm attempting to prevent as much harm as possible because of, yes, it cannot be perfect and it cannot there might be some harm, but I feel like oftentimes, as you said at the very beginning, there's a distorted self understanding which often ignores the responsibility part of it.
Yes. 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 And that is a part of what people of power in the United States often don't enjoy, the responsibility and the accountability, because it doesn't feel good and it doesn't look good. To say I was wrong in this instance or I did this and this created harm. So we attempt to avoid them. But it is something that is completely necessary. And my ideas, I won't be delusional to believe that they still won't have their areas where harm will be crafted. But the intention is, how do we minimize as much harm as possible in order to,
Exactly.
improve conditions for people? How can we minimize harm but also increase innovation? And I think that's that's the issue. People have been trained and conditioned to trade equity for profitability.
Hmm.
We've been told that we need to focus primarily on competition versus cooperation. When in reality, there's so many companies that are in competition with one another, but they still cooperate in order to make sure that they succeed. If you feel that, Pepsi and Coke aren't in dialogue with one another in terms of pricing around the products or the types of flavors that are being released, then you're foolish. I took a trip to Philadelphia one time to visit a friend for New Year's a couple of years ago, and we did the touristy thing of going to try the cheesesteaks in
Hmm.
Philadelphia. So we went to Pat and Gino's, which for those who may be listening are familiar, are these historic businesses that sell Philly cheesesteaks, but they're located directly across the street from one another. So you go to one and then they ask, "Oh, what brings you to Philly?" I just wanted to try the cheesesteaks. And they're like, "Well, we have the best cheesesteaks in the world. You don't have to worry about
Right.
it. Forget those guys across the street. They suck. Their stuff sucks. Our stuff is so much better. We cook it this way. You don't even need to bother trying it." And in reality, what they're doing is they're talking up their competitors.
Yeah, of
So
course.
yeah, so you're feeling like they're insulting them, but they're telling you that, we have the best. They say they have the best, but it's really ours. And then when you go across the street now to buy your second Philly cheesesteak, they ask the same question. It's the same script.
Yeah.
It's, what are you doing here? What brings you to Philly? We have the best. I don't care what they said to you over there. We cook it this way. This is what makes it original and authentic to Philadelphia and blah, 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 blah. And then you leave with two Philly cheesesteaks, two orders of fries, and two drinks so that you can wash them both down. Um, off of one trip. And in reality, like they worked together to keep both their businesses afloat. Um, I think, you know, humanity, professors, students, business owners, directors, you know, CEOs, CFOs, COOs all need to get to a point where they're thinking about what is my communal output? What can I put in my annual report that showcases my contribution to society in addition to how I'm returning money back to my shareholders?
Yes.
What if I looked at the prosperity of the communities that I service and held it in the same regard that I would the pockets of my shareholders?
Yeah.
And what would that look like? And for professors, you know, what does design look like if I expand the canon behind Bauhaus? What does it look like if I look at how countries that are often disregarded? What does design look like in Indonesia? What does it look like
Hmm.
in Vietnam? What does design look like in Pakistan or Botswana or Zambia? What does it look like in Chile and Argentina? What does it
Yeah.
look like in Brazil? And what are their philosophies of making? And how does it differ than what we've normally been taught? Not in a manner of completely disregarding everything that we've been taught about design. We use it to expand our perspective. How can we?
Exactly. It's not a
Yeah,
zero-sum game, right? Like it's additive. It's not taking away from what's there and what's good, but there's so much more to be gained.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I have one quote from your book that I thought also really kind of sums up the conversation we've had so far, and I want to use it to maybe wrap up with a question around how do we build the future leaders, and how do we educate them. The quote is, "Design is not neutral; it amplifies the intentions of those who wield it," which I thought was so pointed. I also personally felt it resonated because you talk about intention, you talk about how that's what design essentially is driven by. So, in the context of that, design is not neutral, it amplifies our intention of those of us who use it. Where does that leave us in terms of what skills do we need to build and cultivate in the future leaders and the young people that you and I and many professors and mentors within companies send out into the world?
Yeah. I mean, I think first and foremost, we need self reflection. We need to be able to understand our own blind spots, our own intentions when it comes to creating things and understanding fully who's going to come into contact with what it is that we make. We also need to be able to understand and map our positionalities. In the book, I talk about positionality mapping and exercises that I have my students do where they map their positionalities and then compare it to the stakeholders that they're designing for so that they can identify, all right, this is, well, defining positionality quickly before I continue. Positionality is the collective intersections of your identity that make you you. So your gender identification, sexual orientation, level of education, place that you grew up, type of community you grew up, whether it was suburban, urban, or rural, languages that you speak, physical ability, religious background or lack thereof. All of these things will influence how it is that you engage with any design solution that's been presented in front of you. Right. And even when you have things in common with people, it might be the country you grew up in, it might be the town that you grew up in, because your gender is different, your socioeconomic background is different, your religious background may be different, all these other things, you will still approach solutions differently. And there may be blind spots that you have to their experiences and vice versa. So if you are designing for that person, you now have to consider how does the intersection of this person's identity lead them to
Right.
respond to particular types of solutions. So from my classes, what I'm attempting to do is teach my students, you have to identify your positionality first. After you've identified your positionality, you then have to identify the positionality of your teammates collectively. This is our perspective collectively, and this is our peer view. Now, after you've done that, you have to understand the positionality of who it is that you are designing for. And then you have to design your solutions for the bottlenecks at the extremes. If I can find the person with the greatest ease and then figure out what their greatest bottlenecks happen to be, even though they're having the greatest ease. And I can find the person with the greatest difficulty and solve for those difficulties. I've now shifted the overall window to
Yes.
where the middle is different and the level of ease is completely different. And I think that's something that most students aren't doing in the classroom. In addition to that, I'll paint the picture for them by asking them, like, how many of you guys grew up reading fairy tales and wishing that you were princes and princesses of some magical kingdom? So, which everyone will raise their hand. And then I'll say to them, what if I tell you that you live better today than the princes and princesses who lived back then?
Yes.
What, they'll look at me like, what do you mean? And I'll say
Yeah.
to them, you can travel the country without the need of hiring somebody to guide you. You have it in your cell phone. You have access to more information that they had. You have running water that you can control the temperature of. You probably have air conditioning at your home. You can get meals just as readily as they would. In fact, you probably don't have to wait on particular seasons to get particular crops because of how things are being distributed in the country that you're in. Like, you have so many benefits that absolve the bottlenecks you would have had if you lived during that time, and that are so far beyond the experiential issues that the princes and princesses had at that moment. I mean, think about the stories where they had to communicate via pigeons, and now you can just send a text
Right.
message.
Yes.
So for me, it's like, you have to track where you are. You have to track where your team is. You have to track the stakeholders, and you have to see the bottlenecks in the extremes so that you can shift that process. And then once you do
Mhm.
that, you find that you start creating a number of innovations that shift how we look at design, shift the type of impact your designs can have, and will begin to shift the intentionality of how we practice.
And that's a great way for us to wrap, because it reminds us of both the need for self-reflection and the responsibility that you get to take then, and from that place actually design a better future
Yes,
that
sir.
is more equitable and that does less harm than if you weren't doing that. So thank you so much for your time, Omari. This was fantastic. I really appreciate it. We will link to the book, to all your writing, and the resources in the show notes so that everyone can follow up, order the book, and make sure that they educate themselves. Hopefully this also spurred some good discussion more broadly in the community of both business leaders and design leaders. So thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. And you have a good day.
And that's a wrap for this week's show. Thank you for listening to Poets and Thinkers. If you like this episode, make sure you hit follow and subscribe to get the latest episodes wherever you listen to your podcast.